The snow came down harder as the city of New York hummed with life, unaware of the silent struggle unfolding in its shadow. On the streets of Lower Manhattan, under the fading glow of the streetlights, two 12-year-old black twins huddled together in a dark corner, trying to shield themselves from the bitter cold. Kira's teeth chattered as she tried to pull the thin, worn-out jacket around her smaller frame. Beside her, Jamal sat slumped, his head resting against her shoulder. His dark eyes were tired, heavy with exhaustion, and his hands, once soft and playful, were now calloused and cold. The snowflakes that clung to their hair and faces seemed to blend into the growing numbness that had taken over their limbs. They were, for all intents and purposes, invisible to the world. Their mother had passed away just a few months ago, leaving them stranded in a world that showed no mercy. They had been forced to leave their home when their mother's medical bills became unmanageable, and the system that was supposed to care for them had failed them miserably. Now, all they had was each other and a few coins left in Kira's pocket. "Kira, I'm so cold." Jamal's voice trembled, breaking the eerie silence that had settled between them. His breath formed a cloud in the freezing air, and Kira could see his lips turning blue, just like hers. "I know, baby. I know," Kira whispered, pressing him closer. "Just hold on. We'll be all right. We have each other." But even as she spoke the words, a heavy weight pressed down on her chest. The reality of their situation was too much. They had no place to go, no family, and no real hope of survival in a city that didn't care about orphans. The sound of footsteps approached in the distance, the sharp click of designer shoes tapping on the icy sidewalk. Kira lifted her head, her tired eyes scanning the crowd, looking for any signs of kindness in a sea of indifferent faces. Then, she saw him, a man, maybe in his late 40s, wearing a dark coat and luxury boots, walking briskly with a purposeful stride. He was clearly someone of importance, a businessman, probably on his way to yet another high-profile dinner or meeting. But something about him made her pause. His face was marked by sharp features, his expression focused, but there was a sense of disconnection as he walked through the city, oblivious to the world around him. Kira wondered for a moment, did he even notice the people who were struggling? Did he care? For a split second, she saw a chance, a faint glimmer of possibility in the shape of the man walking toward her. He could be the one person who might help them. He could change everything. With trembling hands, Kira turned to Jamal. His eyes met hers, and without saying a word, they both knew what had to be done. It was their last chance, the only chance they had left. "Sir, please," Kira's voice barely rose above the noise of the wind. Her words were fragile, fragile like the hope she had left. She reached out her hand, trying to catch his attention. "Please adopt us." The billionaire didn't stop. He continued walking, his head slightly tilted down, focused on the path ahead. But Kira's voice lingered in the air, echoing like a desperate call. Did he even hear her? Kira's heart sank. She almost let out a cry of frustration, but before she could speak again, Jamal's small hand grabbed hers, pulling her back. "Kira, please stop. He won't help us. We're just strangers to him." Jamal's voice was a soft whisper, but the pain behind it was clear. His little face was worn and tired, and his eyes had the look of someone who had been let down too many times. But Kira couldn't stop. She couldn't give up now. Not when they were so close to someone who might finally understand. "Sir!" Kira cried again, her voice growing more desperate as she stood up, despite her shaking legs. "Please! We don't have anywhere else to go. We need help. Please, adopt us." The billionaire's footsteps slowed. Kira's heart raced as she watched him stop, not far from where they sat in the snow. He turned around, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the two children huddled together on the street, their faces pale and frightened. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The snowflakes fell in the empty space between them, and Kira felt as though time itself was holding its breath. The man looked at them, his expression unreadable. He stood still, his gaze flicking from Kira to Jamal, as if measuring them against some invisible yardstick. His eyebrows furrowed in confusion. It was clear that he hadn't expected this kind of encounter. Kira swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. She couldn't believe she was asking him this. She didn't know if he was even capable of understanding. But at that moment, she was willing to take whatever chance came their way. The billionaire, Ethan James, stood in front of the twins, his cold gaze scanning their faces. His first instinct was to keep walking. They were strangers, and what could he do? But something about their faces, their desperation, stopped him. His heart clenched, but his mind quickly told him to look away. He wasn't in the business of helping people like this. He was a businessman, a man whose world revolved around profit margins, not orphans. He had enough problems of his own to deal with. I'm sorry. I can't. His voice was low, almost regretful, but still firm. I can't help you. He turned to walk away, but the words he had spoken, I can't help you, felt like a weight that wouldn't lift. But then, as he took another step, a sudden thought crossed his mind, what if I could? For a brief moment, Ethan stopped. He didn't turn around, but his gaze dropped to the ground in front of him. He heard the twins' voices, barely audible in the howling wind. Their plea was simple, adopt us. Was that too much to ask? What would you do in Ethan's shoes? If you were faced with a situation like this, where two vulnerable children needed you, would you walk away, or would you listen to your heart and act? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. While you're there, tell us where you're watching from, I'll be reading your responses, and I want to know what you think about the decisions these characters are making. Ethan James sat alone in his luxurious office, the city lights sprawling before him like a sea of glittering stars. The hum of the city below felt like a distant murmur, one he could easily ignore, but tonight, it was different. Tonight, his mind wasn't focused on the board meetings, the business ventures, or the deals he had spent his life perfecting. Tonight, there was only one thought pressing against the walls of his mind. The twins. The faces of Kira and Jamal were seared into his memory. Their small hands, wrapped tightly around each other, their shivering bodies, and the desperate plea they had made to him on that freezing night. The words, "Please adopt us," had echoed in his mind long after the encounter had ended. It had been easy to dismiss them, to keep walking, to tell himself that there was nothing he could do, that their situation was just another story among the thousands of homeless children in the city. But the truth was, he couldn't let it go. The thought of them, so fragile, so vulnerable, gnawed at him, refusing to fade into the background. He wasn't a stranger to struggles. He had built his fortune through hard work, making tough decisions and sacrificing everything for the life he had now. But what he had built, his empire, his wealth, his comfort, felt empty tonight. It was clear that no amount of success or luxury could fill the void that had started to open in his chest. Kira and Jamal weren't just strangers asking for help. They were two children who had lost everything. And here he was, a man with all the wealth in the world, yet still unsure of whether he could make a difference. He had been raised in a world where money solved everything, where power was the ultimate currency, and generosity came only after return on investment. But this wasn't about business. This wasn't about money. He had helped countless charities before. He had written checks, attended fundraisers, and even partnered with organizations to build schools and hospitals. But all of that felt superficial, temporary. None of it had ever touched his soul. None of it had ever made him feel like he was truly helping. The weight of this decision grew heavier with each passing minute. Kira and Jamal had been clear in their plea, they needed more than money. They needed something that Ethan had never been asked to give before: his heart, his commitment, his sense of responsibility. And that was a kind of currency he wasn't sure he was willing to spend. He stood up from his desk, walking over to the window that overlooked the sprawling city. The snow had stopped falling for now, but the streets still looked cold, empty. It was a stark contrast to the warm, well-lit space inside his office, where the only thing missing was a sense of purpose. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, a man who had always been in control, always had the answer, always knew what was expected of him. But tonight, for the first time in years, he didn't know who he was. Ethan's thoughts drifted to his own childhood. The image of his father, a hard-nosed businessman, came to mind. The old man had never been one for sentimentality. He had taught Ethan that the world was about survival and power, that money was the ultimate tool to change the world. But now, standing in front of the glass, he realized how little his father's teachings had prepared him for something like this. His childhood had been comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. He had grown up in a home where wealth was never in question, but where love and connection were always secondary. He'd been taught that practicality ruled all decisions, that compassion, while admirable, was often a liability. But now, with the twins' faces still fresh in his mind, Ethan wasn't sure that logic would be enough to guide him through this. Could he adopt them? Could he give them the family they so desperately needed, even if it meant giving up his independence, his freedom, his carefully curated life? The rational side of him said no, it wasn't his responsibility, that helping people like them was something for charities, for people who dedicated their lives to causes like this. But another part of him, a deep, hidden part, said yes. The truth was, he had the resources to help, but what he lacked was the courage to take the first step. The next day, Ethan made a decision. He needed guidance, someone who could ground him in the reality of what he was facing. The first person who came to mind was Maya, a healthcare advocate he had met during his philanthropic efforts. Maya was passionate, driven, and dedicated to issues that mattered. Ethan called her office and arranged a meeting. As soon as he walked into her office, he could see that Maya's expression was one of concern. She was sitting behind a cluttered desk filled with papers, files, and policy drafts. The moment she saw him, she stood up, a smile forming on her face. "Ethan, good to see you. What brings you here today?" Ethan didn't waste time. "I need advice." His voice was serious, more serious than he had ever sounded before. "I'm facing something that's not like any business decision I've ever made." Maya raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I met 2 kids last night. They're orphans. They've been living on the streets for months. They asked me to adopt them." Ethan hesitated, then continued, "I'm not sure what I should do." Maya leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. "Ethan, you know the importance of making decisions that are well thought out, right?" She paused, looking for a reaction. "But when it comes to something like adoption, it's not about calculations. It's about heart." Ethan nodded, his emotions caught between his head and his heart. "I'm not sure I'm ready to let my heart lead this time." Maya leaned forward, her eyes filled with wisdom. "That's the problem. You've been taught to make every decision with your head. But this decision isn't just about you. It's about what's right." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "You've been blessed with resources, but those resources are nothing if they're not used to make a real difference. This isn't about wealth, this is about purpose. You need to decide if you're ready to give them the family they deserve." Ethan felt the weight of her words, the clarity piercing through his confusion. Ethan left Maya's office with a new understanding of what he needed to do. He still had no answers, but for the first time, he felt the stirrings of something deeper than his usual calculations. He had a chance to make a real difference, not just with his money, but with his heart. And as he walked back to his office, he knew that his life, and the lives of Kira and Jamal, were about to change. But the question remained, would he be brave enough to take that first step? Ethan's decision to adopt the twins was not an easy one. It was made in the heat of a moment that had felt like a crossroads, a choice between continuing with his life, the way it had always been, or stepping into something he had never truly understood. But it wasn't just about offering a safe place to stay. It was about realizing that the system they had been cast into was deeply broken, and something needed to change. The first thing Ethan did after that night was to make sure the twins had a safe place to stay. He didn't trust the shelters. He had seen too many reports on how overcrowded and neglected they were. It didn't take long for him to find a reputable emergency care center, a temporary safe haven for children like Kira and Jamal. He made a few calls, pulling strings that only someone with his power could pull. The twins were placed in New Hope Medical Center, a facility that had been offering temporary care to children displaced by the city's foster care system. While it wasn't a long-term solution, Ethan felt it was the best place to get the twins out of harm's way for now. But he didn't want them to feel like they were in a holding pen. The facility was more humane than the shelters, but it was still a place filled with uncertainty, and Ethan knew that wasn't enough. They deserved more than just temporary refuge, they deserved a chance. Ethan sat behind his desk, looking at the list of orphans and foster children who had been placed in the care of New Hope. The facility was just a band-aid on a much deeper issue. He couldn't solve it all in one go, but the more he looked at the names, the more he realized how the system had failed children like Kira and Jamal. This wasn't about a couple of kids he could give a new life to, it was about a broken system that needed to be torn down and rebuilt from the ground up. But that would take time. Time he wasn't sure he had. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was a message from Maya. He opened it, reading quickly. Ethan, we need to talk. The system isn't going to change overnight, but we can start pushing for reform. It was the kind of message that both encouraged him and overwhelmed him. Maya was right, reform wasn't something that could be achieved overnight. But he had to try. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel like the rich businessman with endless resources. He felt like someone who was complicit in a much larger issue, someone who had been blind to the real world outside his skyscraper walls. That evening, after several hours of meetings and phone calls, Ethan made his way to New Hope Medical Center to see the twins again. He had to make things right, or at least try to. He had spent so many years thinking about how to protect his wealth, how to protect his empire, but now he was more concerned with doing the right thing, no matter the cost. The drive across the city was long, and the further Ethan got from the center of Manhattan, the more he felt the weight of the decision he had made. As he approached the hospital, the cold air outside seemed to seep into the car. The city around him felt like a different world. One where the privileged and the underserved existed in stark contrast, yet the twins were part of the broken system that bridged that gap. He had never truly seen the disparity before, but now, it was staring him right in the face. Ethan parked in front of the medical center and stepped out, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The lights of the facility were bright, but as he walked inside, the sterile smell of antiseptic overwhelmed him. The air felt thick, filled with the quiet hum of hospital machines and the low murmurs of busy medical staff. Despite the cleanliness of the environment, there was an emptiness to it. This wasn't a home. This was just a place to wait, to survive for a little while longer. He passed through the halls of the pediatric wing, trying to maintain his composure. His stomach twisted with every step. This wasn't the kind of place he had ever imagined his life intersecting with, but it was where the twins had ended up. Trapped in a system that had left them to fend for themselves. When he reached room 320, he paused for a moment before knocking. The quiet rhythm of the heart monitor inside the room was all he could hear. He didn't want to disturb them, but he also knew he couldn't avoid the reality any longer. He had made a promise, and he needed to follow through. "Come in." Kira's voice was soft but filled with a strange mix of hope and hesitation. Ethan opened the door, his eyes immediately finding the twins sitting on a bed. They both looked up at him, Kira with those deep brown eyes, wide and filled with cautious hope, and Jamal, who was still as guarded as ever. "Mr. James, you came back," Kira said quietly, a hint of surprise in her voice. She had probably convinced herself that he wouldn't return, that he had just been a fleeting figure in their lives. Ethan nodded, trying to smile but finding it difficult. "I'm here. I told you I would be." Kira's lips parted in a tentative smile, but Jamal didn't look up. He kept his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the floor. Ethan could see the walls Jamal had built around himself. He was defensive, skeptical, protecting himself from more disappointment. Ethan wasn't sure how to break through, but he couldn't back down now. He stepped into the room, sitting down at the edge of the bed, carefully keeping a distance that respected the twins' space. He didn't want to overwhelm them, but he also knew that time was running out. Time for them to feel safe, to feel like they belonged somewhere. "How are you both doing?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation light. But it felt forced, like an opening move in a chess game, each word calculated and unsure. Kira responded first, her voice soft but steady. "We're doing okay. Better than before, I guess." She glanced over at Jamal, who remained silent. "We've been through worse." Ethan looked at her, noting the quiet strength in her words. She had been through too much for someone so young, but it didn't break her. He admired her resolve, but it saddened him, too. She should never have had to grow up so fast. Jamal finally spoke, his voice full of anger and disillusionment. "Better? What's better about this? We're stuck in a hospital with us," what Ethan had to offer. "No, Jamal. I don't think money can fix everything." Ethan's voice softened, his sincerity clear. "But I do think I can help. I want to give you both a chance, a real chance. You don't have to keep running, keep surviving. You can live, not just exist." Kira's eyes softened as she looked up at him. Jamal, however, still seemed uncertain, his gaze unyielding. Ethan stood up, his hands resting at his sides. "I want to make sure you both have the life you deserve. I'll help you, but we have to work together." Ethan sat alone in his office the next day, staring at the stack of papers in front of him, his thoughts tangled in a million directions. The conversation with Kira and Jamal had stayed with him, their words and their faces burned into his mind. He had promised them something, a chance. But the gravity of that promise began to sink in. He had always been able to throw money at a problem, solve it with a check or a donation. But this was different. This was about more than just handing over resources, this was about sacrifice, about stepping into their lives in a way he had never done for anyone before. He had made his decision the night before, but now, facing the reality of what he had to do, the task seemed insurmountable. The first thing he had done was call in Maya, the healthcare advocate he had spoken with previously. He needed her expertise, someone who had seen firsthand the cracks in the system. It was clear to him now that just adopting the twins wasn't enough. They needed more, a system overhaul, a guarantee that other children didn't fall through the same cracks. But change was a daunting, unpredictable beast, and Ethan wasn't sure where to start. Maya arrived at his office mid-afternoon, a determined expression on her face, though she could see the weight in Ethan's eyes. As soon as she stepped into the room, she sat down without waiting for him to offer her a chair. "So, you've decided, huh?" she said, cutting straight to the point. Ethan nodded. "I'm in. I want to help Kira and Jamal, but I also want to do something bigger." This isn't just about them. It's about fixing a broken system. Maya leaned forward, a slight smile tugging at her lips. She could see the resolve in Ethan's voice. This wasn't the businessman she had met at charity events, this was someone who had recognized the magnitude of what was at stake. It's a big step, Ethan. Bigger than you probably realize. She paused, eyes narrowing. But if you're serious about this, we need to focus on what's broken first. The foster care system, child welfare in general, is overcrowded and underfunded. There are too many bureaucratic layers, and most of them are designed to keep kids in the system longer than necessary. Adoption's just the beginning of the challenge. Ethan's mind raced as Maya spoke. He had always known that money wasn't the entire answer, but hearing it from someone who had fought the system for years made the task seem almost impossible. But impossible wasn't a word Ethan had ever entertained. He had built his fortune by breaking barriers, by taking on things that seemed unattainable. And this was something that felt worth fighting for. Kira and Jamal were the key, but the door was much larger than just them. What do we need to do? Ethan asked, leaning forward. His voice had an edge of urgency now, as if he was realizing just how much was at stake. Maya looked at him, and for a moment, her expression softened. We start by digging into the root causes of what keeps children like Kira and Jamal in the system. It's not just about adoption. It's about providing them with a chance to thrive, not just survive. We need to reform the policies that allow them to be treated as statistics. We need to find a way to keep families intact, offer support to parents, and ensure that children are protected instead of left to be exploited. Ethan absorbed her words, feeling the weight of the fight ahead. It wasn't just a matter of adopting the twins, although that was the first crucial step. He was about to take on something much larger, changing the system. He had the resources, but more importantly, he had the determination. A conversation with the twins. That evening, Ethan visited New Hope Medical Center again. Kira and Jamal were sitting in their room, the sterile environment still too foreign for them to truly feel at ease. The twins had been placed here after a series of temporary placements in emergency shelters, but it wasn't a permanent solution. Their room was cold, not just in temperature, but in its lack of warmth. A constant reminder of the uncertainty they lived in. Ethan walked into the room and smiled at them. The twins looked up, their faces lighting up with surprise. Kira had always been the more reserved of the two, her expression careful, but tonight, there was a spark of hope in her eyes. Jamal still held his guard up, but even he couldn't completely hide the cautious curiosity in his gaze. "How are you two doing?" Ethan asked, sitting down on the chair beside the bed. His voice was steady, though his mind was racing with the complexity of the situation. "We're okay," Kira answered, but it was clear she was holding back. The walls around her were high, but there was an openness in her demeanor now. Something had shifted since they first met. Jamal didn't speak at first. His arms were crossed over his chest, his eyes not meeting Ethan's, but there was a different kind of tension in his posture tonight. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Ethan continued, "and I want to help, not just for you two, but for other kids who are stuck in the system like you. We're going to start by making sure that you don't have to go back to the life you had. You'll have a home with me, but I also want to do more than that. I'm going to fight to change the system so that kids like you don't have to go through this anymore." Kira's eyes widened, and for the first time, Jamal lowered his arms, looking at Ethan with a mixture of skepticism and hope. "You mean it?" Kira asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "You really want to help us?" Ethan nodded. "I do. You deserve more than this. You deserve a chance to have a better life." Jamal finally spoke, his voice softer now. "Why?" He looked at Ethan, his brow furrowed. "Why are you doing this for us?" We're nobody. Ethan leaned forward, meeting Jamal's eyes. Because everybody deserves a chance, Jamal. I've had the privilege of having everything in my life, but that doesn't mean I should ignore the people who need help. I can't change everything overnight, but I'm going to make sure you both have a future. There was silence for a moment, and then Kira spoke again, her voice hesitant but filled with a quiet strength. We can try. I just want a place to call home. To not be afraid anymore. Ethan nodded. That's the least you deserve. And I'll make sure you get it. For the next few weeks, Ethan continued his work behind the scenes, making connections, setting up meetings with lawyers, social workers, and advocates. His determination to give the twins a chance remained unwavering, but the more he dug into the system, the more he saw how deeply ingrained the problems were. It wasn't just about offering children a place to stay, it was about fixing the infrastructure that kept them in a state of uncertainty and poverty. It wasn't easy. Every step forward seemed to be met with resistance. But Ethan was persistent. He was driven not just by the desire to help Kira and Jamal, but by the realization that their story was not unique. There were thousands of children out there who had been abandoned, ignored, and left to fend for themselves. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. As the days passed, the twins settled into their temporary home at New Hope. But Ethan knew that their journey was just beginning. They weren't safe yet. They hadn't found the stability they needed, and the fight was far from over. But with each passing day, he felt himself growing closer to them. They weren't just orphans anymore, they were part of his mission, part of his life. The days ahead were uncertain, but one thing was clear, Ethan James wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The weeks following his decision felt like a blur of meetings, phone calls, and endless paperwork. Ethan had always been a man of action, someone who made quick, decisive moves in the world of business, but this was different. This wasn't a contract negotiation or a corporate merger. This was about lives, about children who had been left to fend for themselves by a broken system. And Ethan knew that money and influence alone weren't enough to solve their problems. Ethan's world had been one of power, control, and wealth. It had been easy for him to move through life thinking that all problems could be solved with the right amount of resources, but the deeper he delved into the world of child welfare, the more he realized how far removed he was from the reality that Kira and Jamal faced every single day. The more he learned, the more he saw how the system, the very system he had been so entrenched in, was designed to fail children like them. The adoption process was clogged with bureaucratic hurdles, inefficient caseworkers, and a complete lack of funding. Children in the system weren't seen as individuals, they were numbers, stats on a page that would be shuffled around until they aged out or disappeared. Ethan had always believed that his wealth could solve any problem, but now he was discovering that the issue wasn't just about money. The problem lay deeper, deeper than anyone had ever told him. The policies that kept children like Kira and Jamal in temporary shelters, hospitals, and foster homes were fundamentally flawed. And what Ethan had learned in the last few days had made him realize one thing: this system needed to be overhauled. He made the decision to meet with Maya again, not just to discuss the twins' adoption, but to start working on something bigger. Bigger than adoption, bigger than any charity he had ever been involved with. They needed to make sure that no other children like Kira and Jamal had to endure this kind of uncertainty, that no other child had to wait in a broken system for a chance at a family. Maya arrived at his office, her expression focused, but her eyes showing the signs of the long hours she had been putting in. She had been tirelessly working with advocates and social workers on the front lines of child welfare, and Ethan could see that she, too, was ready for something more. I've been talking to some of the biggest advocates in the field, Maya began, as she sat down across from Ethan. We have support for what we're trying to do, but the reality is, we need to have a serious plan to reform the system, or we'll just be spinning our wheels. Ethan leaned forward, his mind already calculating. He had spent years calculating risks and weighing options, but this wasn't a typical business decision. This was about people, about changing lives. And this time, the stakes were higher than anything he had ever faced. "I've been looking at the bigger picture, Maya," Ethan said, his voice steady, but his eyes determined. "The adoption process is just one part of the puzzle. The whole system needs to change. Kids like Kira and Jamal shouldn't have to wait for families. They should be in families already. And the system that keeps them in limbo, well, we need to start working on dismantling that." Maya nodded, but there was a hint of caution in her expression. She had seen these kinds of ideas before, big promises, lofty goals, but the reality was always a different story. She had fought for years for reform, and it was hard to see progress in a system that had been around for so long. "You're right, Ethan," she said quietly. "The system is broken. But do you realize how deep it goes? The money, the policies, they're all in place to keep this system running, to keep it profitable. It's not just about saving children, it's about appending a multi-billion-dollar industry that has its claws in this system. If you want to change this, you have to be willing to take on more than just a few government officials." Ethan took a deep breath. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but hearing Maya put it so plainly made the task ahead seem even more daunting. This wasn't just about helping the twins, it was about fighting for an entire generation of children who were being left behind. "I'm not afraid of a fight," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "But I don't want to just be a part of the conversation. I want to lead it. I want to change this. Not just for Kira and Jamal, but for all the kids out there who don't have a voice." Maya sat in silence for a moment, letting Ethan's words settle. It was clear that he wasn't just looking for a quick fix. He was looking for a legacy, something that would outlast the fight for these two children. "If you want to change the system," Maya said, finally breaking the silence, "you're going to need more than just money. You're going to need to build alliances, bring in lawmakers, and get the media involved. This is going to take time, and it's going to get ugly. You'll have to face off against some of the most powerful people in the city. But if you're serious about this, I'll stand by you. We'll fight together." Ethan nodded, a deep sense of resolve growing within him. He had never felt more certain about anything in his life. He was going to take on the system, and he wasn't going to do it alone. Later that afternoon, Ethan met with a team of legal experts and advocates for children's rights. He gathered a group of people who were just as committed as he was to creating real change. The task ahead of them was enormous, but for the first time in Ethan's life, he wasn't afraid of the scale of it. He was ready. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. There were laws to change, systems to challenge, and political forces to contend with. But he was in this for the long haul. And with Kira and Jamal at the center of it all, Ethan wasn't just fighting for their futures. He was fighting for the future of every child who had been forgotten by the system. Ethan left the meeting that evening with a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a billionaire in a glass tower. He had become a fighter, for the twins, for children across the city, and for the system that had failed them. But there was still much work to be done. He couldn't let up, not now. As he walked out of the building and into the cold air of New York, he felt the weight of the world shift on his shoulders. He had a long road ahead, but he was ready. He was committed to change. But what he didn't know yet was just how far the system would fight back. Ethan's world had always been one of certainty, an environment where the rules were clear, and the stakes were high, but not impossible to navigate. He had spent years building an empire that ran on a very simple principle: if you have the power, you can shape the world around you. But as he moved forward in his efforts to help Kira and Jamal, he realized how fragile that power really was when pitted against a system that had been ingrained for generations. The more Ethan worked on the issue of child welfare reform, the more he realized just how deeply entrenched the status quo really was. It wasn't just about getting the twins adopted, or about fixing the immediate issues they faced, it was about battling against a network of corruption, bureaucracy, and institutional indifference. These systems didn't want to change, and the people who benefited from them weren't going to let him tear it all down easily. Ethan's first taste of resistance came when he began meeting with officials from the Child Welfare Department. What he thought would be a simple discussion about the state of adoption in New York quickly turned into a bureaucratic maze that he couldn't quite navigate. Every question he asked seemed to be met with a stalling answer, every proposal countered with a policy that didn't allow for change. The more he pressed, the more he saw how the system was designed to keep children like Kira and Jamal disenfranchised, and how it ensured the privileged continued to profit from their plight. At one point, a well-dressed bureaucrat named Lydia Roth, a senior official in the department, met with him to discuss a potential reform proposal. Ethan was prepared. He had all the data, the statistics, and the research he needed. He had also brought in child welfare advocates, who were passionate about real reform. He thought he was ready for any challenge she might throw his way, but nothing could have prepared him for the conversation that unfolded. Lydia smiled thinly as she sat across from him, her fingers drumming lightly on her desk, clearly not invested in the conversation. "Ethan," she said, her voice sweet but condescending, "we all agree that the system needs work. But you can't expect to just come in here and change everything overnight. There are policies in place for a reason. You can't just throw money at the problem and expect it to go away." Ethan leaned forward, his frustration barely contained. "I'm not just throwing money at this. I'm here because these kids deserve better. And this system is failing them. The bureaucracy, the inefficiency, the neglect, it's built into the foundation of this entire system." Lydia's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Ethan, you're new to this. You don't understand the full picture. The foster care system is incredibly complex. You don't just change it because you feel like it's broken." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He wasn't sure what angered him more, the dismissal in Lydia's voice or the truth behind her words. She was right in some ways, he didn't fully understand the system. But he was beginning to see how that didn't matter. It wasn't about understanding, it was about making the right choices. "Then help me understand," Ethan demanded. "Help me understand why kids like Kira and Jamal, who have been through hell, have to suffer more simply because the system can't be bothered to treat them like human beings." Lydia leaned back, clearly growing tired of the conversation. "I think this is a waste of time, Ethan. You should stick to your charity work and leave the governance to people who understand the complexities of these systems." That was it. Ethan was done. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He didn't bother saying goodbye, he didn't need to. The conversation had shown him all he needed to know. Lydia and people like her didn't care. They had built their entire careers on the backs of children like Kira and Jamal, and the system would fight back against anyone who tried to upset the delicate balance they had created. The more Ethan tried to push for change, the more the system pushed back. The next obstacle came when he tried to get in touch with lawmakers to sponsor his reform proposal. His calls were returned with excuses, the timing was wrong, the votes weren't there, the funding wasn't available. Every politician he spoke to seemed to have a reason why they couldn't commit, but all of them were very willing to accept his donations to their re-election campaigns. It became clear that the institutional resistance was not just about inefficiency or red tape. It was about power. The system had been built to keep the wealthy, the well-connected, and the powerful in control. Ethan had already started to see how money, his money, had the power to disrupt this balance. But now, he had to face the bitter reality, money alone wasn't enough. He needed alliances, voices, and the courage to face down an entire system that didn't want to change. As weeks passed, Ethan found himself becoming frustrated and disillusioned. He spent countless hours in meetings, drafting legal proposals, and pushing back against every barrier the system threw his way. But despite the setbacks, there was something within him that wouldn't let go. The twins' faces, Kira's quiet strength, Jamal's defiant anger, reminded him of why he had to keep fighting. If not for them, then who? One afternoon, Ethan found himself back at New Hope Medical Center. The twins had been settling in, but the reality of their situation had not improved. The more he saw them, the more he understood that simply providing them with a home wasn't enough. They needed stability, security, and a system that wasn't going to throw them out when they turned 18. He knocked on their door and walked in, his heart heavy. Kira was sitting by the window, looking out at the city, her eyes distant. Jamal was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. "How are you both today?" Ethan asked, his voice softer than it had been during their first meeting. Kira smiled, but it was a small, quiet smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "We're okay. It's hard, but we're making it." Jamal sat up, his eyes meeting Ethan's. "When can we leave?" Ethan blinked, surprised by the directness of the question. "You'll be out of here soon." He paused, then added, "I'm working on something. I'll make sure you both get the life you deserve." Later that evening, as Ethan sat alone in his office, staring at the glowing city lights below, he knew the battle had just begun. The fight wasn't just against the individuals he was meeting, this was a fight against the very system that had been designed to keep kids like Kira and Jamal in perpetual limbo. And for the first time, Ethan didn't feel afraid. He felt determined, because he knew that change was inevitable. It was a week after his last meeting with Maya when the weight of the situation truly hit Ethan. The system, the one that had entrapped so many vulnerable children like Kira and Jamal, wasn't going to fall easily. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Ethan found himself sitting at his desk in the quiet of his office, the city lights casting long shadows across the polished floors. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, and for a fleeting moment, he didn't recognize the person looking back. When he'd first agreed to help Kira and Jamal, it had felt like a noble pursuit, something that could be solved with just a bit of effort, money, and willpower. But now, after the endless meetings and the bureaucratic barriers that seemed to multiply with every passing day, he was beginning to realize that changing the system would require more than just financial backing. It would require grit, strategy, and most importantly, a willingness to get his hands dirty in ways he had never anticipated. The phone buzzed, snapping Ethan out of his reverie. It was a text from Maya, reminding him about the upcoming meeting with some key lawmakers, a session where they would lobby for the kind of reforms that could prevent children from being thrown into the system without any real chance of escaping it. The message was brief, but it carried a weight that made Ethan pause. Change wasn't easy. It wasn't meant to be easy, not when you were going up against forces that had been in place for decades. But for Ethan, it wasn't about the system anymore. It was about the children, Kira, Jamal, and so many others who had been discarded and left to fend for themselves. They had seen firsthand how cruel the system could be, how it had taken everything from them. Now, it was Ethan's turn to give back. He couldn't back down. Not when he had seen the faces of children who had lost everything. The meeting the next day was set to take place at a conference room in one of the old buildings downtown. Ethan arrived early, his thoughts clouded with the pressure of the task ahead. He had already met with several organizations, had gathered research on the issues surrounding child welfare, but today felt like the true test. Today would determine whether he could truly make a difference, or whether he was just another wealthy man who thought he could use his resources to solve problems that didn't concern him. Ethan walked into the room, where a handful of legislators, advocates, and lawyers had already gathered. The air was thick with tension. These weren't people who saw the world through the same lens as Ethan. They weren't concerned with the luxury of their city penthouses or the power plays that happened in boardrooms. They were there because they had seen the reality of the situation, children who were overlooked, left behind, and forgotten by a system that wasn't built to protect them. "Glad you could make it, Ethan." Maya greeted him as he entered the room. She looked exhausted, but there was fire in her eyes. She had been fighting this fight for years, and now she had allies who were finally ready to take a stand. Ethan gave a tight smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm here to make sure we don't let them down." Maya nodded. "Good. This won't be easy, but we're on the right track." The meeting began with a series of briefings on the current state of the foster care system, data, statistics, and the horrifying realities that had been swept under the rug for far too long. The adoption rate was down, the number of children living in temporary shelters was increasing, and family reunification programs were underfunded. For Ethan, the figures were overwhelming. He had heard the stories before, but seeing the numbers in front of him made the problem feel insurmountable. But what struck him the most were the stories of families who had been torn apart, of children who had slipped through the cracks. One story in particular stood out, a boy named Tyler, who had been placed in over 10 different foster homes before he turned 14. By the time he aged out of the system, he had nowhere to go. He had been through abuse, neglect, and rejection, and his story wasn't unique. It was common. Ethan's jaw clenched as he listened. The weight of the injustice was becoming too much. How could he have been so blind to the lives of these children? How could he have lived in his bubble, untouched by the suffering that existed just outside his reach? As the meeting progressed, the lawmakers were presented with the proposed reforms. Ethan had pushed hard for a national initiative that would improve the adoption process and increase funding for family reunification programs. The proposal was ambitious, but it was one that could make a real difference. It focused on making the system more efficient, transparent, and accountable, a far cry from the ineffective bureaucracy that existed now. But not everyone was convinced. There were powerful people in the room who didn't like the changes Ethan was proposing. Some of the lawmakers were hesitant, questioning the costs of such an initiative, while others flat out dismissed the idea. They were more concerned with the political fallout than with the real lives at stake. "Ethan, you're asking for a huge shift in policy here," one legislator said, his voice full of doubt. "How do you plan to convince the public and get these reforms passed?" Ethan's frustration mounted. He had seen this kind of pushback before, people who were more concerned about political gain than the well-being of the children who were suffering. But he wasn't going to back down. "Not now. I'm asking for change because these kids deserve more than the system has given them. I'm asking because the system is failing them." Ethan's voice was firm, unwavering. "We have the resources, we have the power to make a difference. The question is, are you willing to stand up and do something about it?" The room fell silent. Maya shot Ethan a look of approval, while several others nodded in agreement. The pushback had been expected, but Ethan's words had struck a chord with some. There was still a long road ahead, but Ethan knew this was just the beginning. The fight for reform wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But it was worth it. By the time the meeting ended, there was no clear victory, but progress had been made. Some of the lawmakers were beginning to warm to the idea, and the advocates in the room had pledged their support. It wasn't enough to secure a win yet, but it was a step in the right direction. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a sense of hope. The journey was far from over, but the fight had begun, and he wasn't backing down. As Ethan left the meeting room, he felt the weight of the day on his shoulders. But it wasn't the weight of defeat. It was the weight of determination, a promise he had made to Kira and Jamal and every other child who had been forgotten. He was committed to seeing this through, no matter the challenges ahead. As he stepped out into the cold New York evening, Ethan knew that this battle was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but he had started something, and he wasn't going to stop until he saw it through. The days after the meeting with lawmakers felt like a whirlwind for Ethan. The initial resistance he faced from the system had not been enough to deter him. Instead, it had fueled him, pushing him further into the fight for reform. He wasn't just trying to adopt Kira and Jamal anymore, he was battling for the future of every child trapped in the broken system they had grown up in. Change wasn't just possible, it was necessary. Ethan's focus sharpened. He spent long hours meeting with more advocates, speaking with lawmakers, and organizing meetings with other philanthropists who were beginning to take notice of his efforts. He had become a voice, a loud, unwavering voice, for the children who had been forgotten, the children who had no one to fight for them. He had known wealth all his life, but now he was starting to understand the weight of real power, the kind that came from standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. One afternoon, a breakthrough came when he received a call from Maya. Her voice, always calm and composed, was filled with an energy he hadn't heard before. "Ethan, we have some big news." She paused, a breath of excitement on the other end of the line. The adoption bill passed the first committee. Ethan blinked, his heart skipping a beat. "Wait, what?" "Yes. It's a major victory." Maya continued. "We've been able to get enough support from the lawmakers who've been on the fence. This is a huge first step." Ethan felt a rush of emotions flood over him. This was it, the first step toward the change he had been fighting for. The system that had once seemed so impenetrable, so rigid, was starting to bend. And in the midst of it all, Kira and Jamal had become a symbol of the cause, representing every child who had been failed by the system. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a wave of relief washing over him. But that relief was fleeting. The hard work had only just begun. That evening, Ethan went to New Hope Medical Center again. He had spent weeks on the phone, in meetings, and researching the next steps, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just there as a benefactor or a businessman, he was there as someone who had made a promise. When he entered the room, Kira and Jamal were sitting together, their small frames huddled under the hospital blanket. They looked up as he entered, their expressions unreadable, as if they were waiting for him to say something. Their lives had been turned upside down so many times that perhaps they were waiting for another broken promise, another disappointment. Ethan smiled softly and sat down on the chair beside their bed. "How are you both doing today?" Kira met his eyes first. "We're okay." Her voice was steady, but there was a subtle vulnerability behind the words. She had grown up fast, and it was clear she wasn't used to trusting adults anymore. Jamal, on the other hand, didn't meet Ethan's eyes. His arms were crossed tightly, his body language still defensive. Ethan had expected this. He understood it. Jamal had every reason to be angry, to mistrust anyone who had ever made promises and failed to keep them. "I wanted to talk to you both about something," Ethan began, his voice quieter now, more personal. "The adoption bill we've been working on passed the first committee. It's just the first step, but it's a big one. And I want you to know that this isn't just about you two anymore. This is about all the kids who need a chance, like you. We're going to change the system. And I'm going to make sure you both have a future, a real one." Kira's eyes widened, and Jamal's posture softened, just a little. He didn't say anything, but there was something in his eyes that told Ethan everything. For the first time, maybe, Jamal believed. Kira smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but one that spoke volumes. "You're serious, aren't you?" Ethan nodded. "I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you." As the days turned into weeks, the momentum for the adoption reform grew. Ethan worked tirelessly, meeting with lawmakers, social workers, and philanthropists. He worked to build a coalition of people who were just as committed to changing the system as he was. The media began to take notice of the movement, and public support began to swell. But with every victory came more obstacles. The system was entrenched in years of bureaucracy, and not everyone was willing to let go of the power they had. Some tried to discredit Ethan, others tried to slow down the process, but he was unwavering. The fight was long, and the stakes were higher than ever. One evening, after another grueling day of meetings, Ethan sat in his office, alone. His desk was cluttered with documents, reports, and memos, each one a step toward progress, but each one also a reminder of how much more work was left to do. But as he sat back in his chair, his thoughts turned to Kira and Jamal, the children who had sparked this entire movement. They were safe now, in a temporary home, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough until they were truly free from the system that had kept them trapped. Until they had a family of their own. A real family. Ethan's heart clenched as he thought about the future, his future with the twins. They were already changing his life in ways he hadn't imagined. What had started as an impulsive decision had turned into a lifelong commitment. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. The last step. One evening, as Ethan walked into New Hope Medical Center to check in on the twins, he was greeted by Kira, who was standing by the window, looking out at the city. Jamal was in the corner, fiddling with the remote control, lost in his own thoughts. "How are you two doing today?" Ethan asked, taking a step into the room. Kira smiled. "We're better, Mr. James. Thank you for everything." There was a warmth in her voice that hadn't been there before. She had started to believe in the possibility of a better life. Jamal nodded, though he still wasn't ready to fully open up. But there was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken bond that was slowly beginning to form. "I have good news," Ethan said, his voice soft but filled with certainty. "We've made real progress with the adoption process. The legislation is moving forward, and we're closer than ever to making sure that kids like you won't have to go through what you've been through." Kira's eyes sparkled with hope. Jamal didn't say much, but his expression softened. He was starting to believe. "You're not alone anymore," Ethan added, his voice firm with conviction. "You'll always have a place with me." As Ethan walked out of the medical center that night, he felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't just helping Kira and Jamal. He was helping thousands of other kids who had been forgotten. And that thought gave him the strength to keep going. The road ahead would be long, but Ethan James was determined. And he wasn't going to stop until he had changed the system for good.